2,300 years ago, a merchant lost every single thing he owned in one afternoon, and by any reasonable measure, that should have been the end of his story. It was not. It was the beginning of one of the most influential philosophies human beings have ever produced, one that would go on to guide a Roman emperor through decades of war, comfort a former slave who had already lost everything a person can lose, and steady a wealthy statesman as he watched his entire world collapse around him. It would nearly disappear entirely for over 1,000 years, and it would come back quietly, powerfully, into therapy offices, elite sports psychology, military resilience training, and the phones of millions of people who have never read a word of ancient Greek, and often do not even know the word Stoic came from anywhere at all. This is the complete story of how that happened. Told properly, from the beginning, not the shortened version. Most people who have heard of Stoicism know a fragment of it, a quote about controlling what you can control, a phrase, memento mori, remember you will die, maybe a name, Marcus Aurelius, attached vaguely to the idea of a wise Roman emperor. What almost nobody knows is the actual sequence of events and the actual people that turned one man's disaster into a body of thought that has now survived longer than most empires, most religions, and every single political system that has ever tried to replace it. This story does not start with a philosopher in a toga, calmly lecturing from a position of comfort. It starts with a shipwreck, a bankrupt merchant standing in a foreign city with nothing left, and a question that should sound familiar to anyone who has ever lost something they thought they could not survive losing. What do you do now? Over the next several chapters, this series will trace that question all the way from a ruined cargo ship off the coast of Greece, through the marketplace where a new kind of school was built, with no walls and no tuition, across the sea to a Roman Empire that badly needed exactly what this philosophy offered, into the private notebooks of three men, a slave, a statesman, and an emperor, who each took the same core ideas and lived them out under wildly different, often brutal circumstances. And then it will follow the philosophy almost to extinction and back out the other side, into your century, quietly running underneath practices you may already be using without knowing where they came from. None of this required Zeno, or Seneca, or Epictetus, or Marcus Aurelius to have an easy life. If anything, the opposite. Every major figure in this story built or refined this philosophy while their own life was actively falling apart around them. That is not a coincidence, and by the end of this series, it will not feel like one either. This is part 1, Origins, where it actually began and why. To understand why Stoicism took hold the way it did, you have to understand what the world looked like right before it arrived, because it did not appear in a calm, stable era looking for intellectual entertainment. It appeared in the wreckage of one. For about a century, the Eastern Mediterranean had been dominated by one towering figure, a young Macedonian king who built an empire stretching from Greece to India faster than almost anyone in history. And then, at only 32 years old, died suddenly, with no clear successor and no plan for what came next. What followed was not stability. It was decades of his former generals tearing the empire apart between themselves, city-states changing hands, alliances shifting, wars breaking out and dying down and breaking out again, an entire generation growing up watching political certainty dissolve into permanent, low-grade chaos. This mattered enormously for philosophy, because the great schools of the previous century, the ones built by Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, had mostly been designed for a very different kind of world. A world where a citizen's identity was tightly bound to a stable city-state, where public life, civic duty, and philosophy were assumed to unfold inside a predictable, structured political order. That order was now gone, or at least badly damaged, and it was not coming back in any form the previous generation would have recognized. Ordinary people, and not just aristocrats with the leisure to study philosophy, were left asking a much more urgent question than, what is the ideal city? They were asking something closer to, how do I stay sane and stay good in a world I clearly do not control and cannot predict? Fortunes could be made and lost overnight, depending on which general's army happened to march through your city that year. Political exile, sudden poverty, and violent upheaval were not rare misfortunes reserved for the unlucky. They were increasingly the ordinary texture of life for enormous numbers of people across the Greek world. This is the actual soil Stoicism grew out of. Not a comfortable academic puzzle about abstract virtue, but a widespread, urgent, practical demand for a way to live well and stay steady inside conditions nobody could guarantee or control. Several new philosophical schools emerged in Athens during exactly this period, all essentially competing to answer the same question in different ways. Stoicism was one answer among several. To understand why it eventually outlasted the others, you first have to understand what its early rivals actually offered, and why, for most people, it was not quite enough. Two other major schools rose in Athens around the same period, both offering serious, competing answers to the exact same problem, and both worth understanding, because Stoicism was built partly in direct contrast to them. The first was Epicureanism, founded by a philosopher named Epicurus, who taught that the good life was found through pleasure, carefully defined not as constant indulgence, but as the absence of pain and disturbance, achieved by withdrawing from public turmoil into a quiet, close-knit community of friends. There is real wisdom in this, and Epicurus was not the shallow hedonist later critics sometimes painted him as. But his solution, at its core, was withdrawal. Step back from the chaos of public life, minimize your exposure to it, and cultivate calm in a protected private space, ideally a garden among trusted friends. For a philosopher with the means to retreat, this worked. For a merchant, a soldier, a magistrate, a mother raising children in an unstable city, withdrawal from public life was rarely a realistic option. The chaos was not something you could simply opt out of. It was going to find you regardless, and Epicureanism, for all its genuine insight, offered comparatively little guidance for facing it head-on. The second major rival was skepticism, associated with a philosopher named Pyrrho, which took a different, in some ways more radical approach entirely. If certainty about the world was impossible, the skeptics argued, then the wise response was to suspend judgment altogether on almost everything, and let that suspension itself produce a kind of untroubled peace. There is a real logical elegance to this position. There is also a serious practical problem. Most people cannot actually run their lives, raise families, hold jobs, make decisions under pressure, while suspending judgment on nearly everything around them. Radical suspension of judgment, taken seriously as a full-time practice, is closer to a philosophical performance than a livable strategy for people who still had to show up and act in an unstable world. Stoicism's eventual answer split the difference in a genuinely new way. Do not withdraw from public life like the Epicureans, and do not suspend judgment on everything like the skeptics. Stay fully engaged in the world exactly as it is. Take clear, confident judgments about what actually matters, and locate your peace of mind somewhere the surrounding chaos could never actually reach in the first place. Your own judgments and choices, not external outcomes. That single move, engagement without dependence on outcomes, is the seed every later Stoic idea grows out of. It did not come from a comfortable philosopher theorizing in the abstract. It came from a man who had just lost absolutely everything and needed an answer that actually worked. His name was Zeno, and before any of this, he was not a philosopher at all. He was a merchant from Citium, a trading city on the island of Cyprus, working in the Phoenician purple dye trade, a genuinely profitable, unglamorous business built on ships, cargo, and the constant risk that came with both. Around 300 BCE, give or take a few years depending on which ancient source you trust, Zeno was sailing a shipment of valuable purple dye from Phoenicia toward Athens or Piraeus, a routine commercial voyage he had likely made many times before. The ship never arrived intact. It wrecked, and with it, Zeno's entire cargo, and by most accounts, the bulk of his personal fortune, sank into the sea in a single afternoon. He survived. His business and the comfortable, secure life it had been building toward did not. Picture the actual moment this required getting through, not the philosophical legend that came later, the real, unremarkable human moment. A man in his 30s, alone in an unfamiliar city, most of what he owned now sitting at the bottom of the sea, with no immediate plan and, as far as the historical record shows, no wealthy family waiting to catch him. This is not a comfortable origin story invented later to make the philosophy sound more dramatic. Ancient biographers, writing centuries afterward, record it fairly consistently, and it lines up with everything Zeno built afterward, in a way that only makes sense if it actually happened roughly as described. By the account most widely repeated in antiquity, Zeno wandered into a bookseller's shop in Athens sometime after the wreck, whether by accident or out of simple restlessness, and happened to hear a reading from a work about Socrates, most likely Xenophon's Memorabilia, a text preserving stories and teachings of the philosopher who had been executed roughly a century earlier for the crime of asking too many uncomfortable questions. Something in what he heard struck him immediately and hard. He reportedly asked the bookseller where he might find a man like that, a living teacher who thought this way. By chance, or by the kind of coincidence historians are always faintly suspicious of, a well-known Cynic philosopher named Crates happened to be walking past the shop at that exact moment. The bookseller pointed him out. "Follow that man," he told Zeno. Zeno did follow him, and it changed the entire remaining course of his life. Instead of trying to rebuild his old life exactly as it had been, chase the dye trade back to where it had left off, recover the specific fortune the sea had swallowed, he apprenticed himself to Crates, and then studied under several other philosophers active in Athens at the time, absorbing ideas from multiple competing schools over roughly the next decade. He was not building a philosophy from nothing in isolated genius. He was synthesizing it deliberately out of the strongest available pieces of what already existed around him, filtered hard through the one lesson his own disaster had already taught him without any classroom involved at all. That you can lose every external thing you have built in a single afternoon through absolutely no failure of judgment or character on your part and still be left with something. The way you choose to respond was never on that ship. Sometime around 300 BCE, after years of study under multiple teachers, Zeno began teaching his own students in Athens, not inside a formal, enclosed academy the way Plato's followers had, but in a public, open colonnade called the Stoa Poikile, the Painted Porch, named for the vivid battle murals decorating its walls. The location itself mattered more than it might first appear. It was a public gathering space in the middle of the Athenian marketplace, the agora, not a private garden reserved for an exclusive circle of paying students the way the Epicureans operated. Anyone walking through the agora that day, a merchant on business, a soldier off duty, a slave running an errand, could stop, sit down on the stone benches, and simply listen. There was no formal enrollment process recorded, no significant tuition barrier the way some rival schools required. Philosophy, in Zeno's version of it, was not going to be a luxury good reserved for the wealthy and leisured. It was going to be argued out loud, in public, where anyone who needed it badly enough could actually get to it. His students and followers eventually became known as Stoics, simply meaning the people from the Stoa, from the porch, a name that started more or less as a casual, almost offhand nickname for where they happened to gather, the way you might describe a group by naming the coffee shop they always met at. The name stuck permanently, long after the actual physical building it referred to had crumbled into dust and vanished from any map. What Zeno taught there, over the following decades, until his death sometime around 262 BCE, built directly on that one hard lesson from the shipwreck, but formalized now into an actual structured system. Live according to nature, he argued, meaning according to reason, since reason is the defining, distinguishing feature of human nature specifically. Virtue, not wealth, not reputation, not physical comfort, is the only genuine good, the only thing that reliably makes a life good, because it is the only thing that cannot be taken from you by a storm at sea, a hostile army, a corrupt official, or simple ordinary bad luck. Everything else, health, money, reputation, comfort, even your own physical survival, gets carefully reclassified as indifferent, worth pursuing sensibly when reasonably available, but never worth staking your actual well-being on, because none of it was ever fully within your control to begin with. And Zeno had the scar of a lost fortune to prove exactly how fast that lesson can arrive uninvited. None of this stayed static after Zeno's death. Two more heads of the school, Cleanthes and then Chrysippus, spent the following decades refining, systematizing, and in Chrysippus's case, dramatically expanding the philosophy into something closer to a complete, rigorous intellectual system, with detailed positions on logic and natural science, sitting alongside the ethics. By the time later generations inherited it, Stoicism was no longer just one merchant's hard-won answer to his own disaster. It was a fully built, internally coherent school of thought, tested and refined by multiple serious thinkers over multiple generations, and it was about to travel a very long way from that one painted porch in Athens. It is worth pausing here, before the story moves to Rome, to understand exactly what made the Stoa function so differently from its rivals, because the difference was not just architectural. It shaped who the philosophy actually reached, and that in turn shaped everything about how it eventually spread. Plato's Academy and Aristotle's Lyceum were both, in practice, formal institutions with property, ongoing funding structures, and a degree of institutional permanence, closer to what you might recognize today as a university. They produced extraordinary foundational work, and neither school should be understood as somehow lesser for how it operated. But their structure came with a natural filtering effect. Sustained, serious study at either institution generally required the kind of leisure time, and often the kind of family wealth, that a working merchant, a soldier, or a laborer simply did not have available to spend on it. The Stoa operated on a fundamentally different model. There was no campus to maintain, no significant tuition gate to clear, no requirement that you commit years of your life away from earning a living in order to participate. You could stop by on your lunch break. You could listen for 10 minutes on your way through the agora to somewhere else entirely, and come back again the following week, or never come back at all. This was philosophy structured for people who could not afford to treat philosophy as a full-time occupation, which, when you consider the vast majority of the ancient population, was almost everyone alive at the time. This structural openness attracted a genuinely wider range of students than the more formal schools typically drew. And the philosophy itself was explicitly built to travel well outside the specific context of a classroom in the first place. Zeno was not primarily interested in abstract metaphysical puzzles that only made sense inside a lecture hall. He was interested in a fairly direct, practical question. How does a person actually live well, day to day, regardless of their specific circumstances, their social class, or their current fortune? That question does not require a permanent classroom to keep being useful. It travels perfectly well in a soldier's kit bag, a merchant's memory, or eventually, centuries later, a Roman emperor's private notebook written during actual military campaigns, or a former slave's spoken lectures, transcribed secondhand by one of his own students because he himself never wrote any of it down. There is one more piece worth understanding clearly before this story leaves Greece behind, because it is the exact piece that made Stoicism durable enough to survive everything still ahead of it in this series. 3 empires, several near-total collapses, and roughly 2,000 years. Stoicism was built, from its very first public lecture on that painted porch, to be tested against real adversity rather than merely discussed in comfortable, hypothetical terms. Other schools of the period often centered heavily on abstract argument for its own sake, careful logical puzzles debated in relatively comfortable, stable settings among people who mostly had the leisure to debate them. The Stoics certainly engaged in serious logical and even scientific argument too. Chrysippus in particular was a formidable, prolific logician by any measure. But the ethical core of the philosophy was explicitly designed as something you were meant to actually use, under pressure, in the middle of your actual life, not something you merely admired from a safe, comfortable distance while your circumstances remained convenient and undisturbed. This distinction matters enormously for understanding everything that happens next in this story. A philosophy engineered primarily for calm, comfortable discussion in stable conditions tends to struggle badly the moment real conditions stop being calm or comfortable. A philosophy explicitly engineered from its very first principles to be applied especially when conditions are at their absolute worst has a much better chance of actually surviving contact with a crisis and of continuing to feel genuinely useful to the people living through one. That is precisely the version of Stoicism that was about to cross the sea into an empire defined, at almost every level of its long history, by exactly that kind of relentless instability. Sudden political violence, constant, grinding warfare on shifting and often distant frontiers, fortunes and entire family lines made and catastrophically destroyed within a single generation, sometimes within a single week, at the whim of one unpredictable, occasionally unstable man sitting on a throne in Rome. If Greek Stoicism had been built for a chaotic post-Alexander world, Roman Stoicism was about to be stress-tested against something in several ways considerably worse. Decades of imperial politics where a single sentence, spoken carelessly to the wrong person at the wrong dinner, could get an otherwise powerful, wealthy, well-connected man executed within the week. Stoicism did not arrive in Rome all at once, in one dramatic, clean moment. It arrived gradually, carried mostly by traveling teachers, diplomatic missions, and the enormous cultural gravity Greek thought already carried throughout the wider Mediterranean world by this point in history. One especially important early moment happened in 155 BCE, when Athens sent a delegation of 3 prominent philosophers, representing 3 different schools including the Stoics, to Rome on an unrelated diplomatic matter concerning a political dispute back home. While waiting for their business to be formally settled, the visiting philosophers gave a series of public lectures in the city, and Roman audiences, many hearing serious philosophical argument, delivered this directly and this skillfully for what may have been the very first time, were reportedly captivated by what they encountered. Some of Rome's more traditionalist senators, worried openly about corrupting foreign influence over Roman youth, were considerably less enthusiastic about the visit. But the door, once opened even that narrowly, did not close again. Educated Romans increasingly began sending their own sons to study philosophy in Greece directly, or hired Greek tutors to bring the teaching to them at home in Rome instead. Over the following century, Stoicism specifically, more than most of its Greek rivals, found an especially receptive audience among the Roman aristocracy, and the reasons for that were not accidental or a matter of simple cultural fashion. Roman culture already placed enormous, deeply ingrained value on discipline, duty, and public service, on the idea that a man's worth was measured substantially by how well he served the state and upheld his obligations to family and community, sometimes at real personal cost. Stoicism's core emphasis on virtue, duty, and disciplined, rational self-control mapped remarkably well onto values Romans already held dear before a single Stoic teacher ever set foot in the city. This was not a foreign philosophy asking Romans to abandon their existing values in favor of something else entirely. It was, in many important respects, a sophisticated, deeply reasoned intellectual framework that reinforced and refined values many Romans already believed in instinctively, while giving them considerably sharper, more precise tools for actually living by those values consistently under real pressure. A Roman senator named Cato the Younger became one of the philosophy's most visible early Roman champions, famous even among his own political rivals for an almost legendary personal discipline, walking barefoot through harsh weather, eating simple, plain food by deliberate choice, despite his considerable wealth, all as a form of ongoing practice in tolerating hardship voluntarily. So that hardship, when it eventually arrived uninvited, as it always eventually does, would hold less power over him. Cato's fierce, uncompromising opposition to Julius Caesar and his eventual dramatic suicide, rather than accept life under what he saw as an illegitimate tyranny, would later be held up by Roman Stoics for generations afterward as a powerful, if genuinely complicated, example of Stoic principle carried all the way through to its absolute final, most extreme conclusion. But it was not really Cato's dramatic, singular example alone that embedded Stoicism permanently into Roman life. It was the sheer, relentless scale of instability built into the everyday texture of Roman political and social existence, especially as the old republic began its long, grinding collapse into civil war, and later into the frequently volatile politics of the imperial system that eventually replaced it. Consider for a moment what daily life could genuinely look like for a wealthy, powerful, well-connected Roman man during this specific period. He could be spectacularly successful, wealthy, respected, holding meaningful public office, deeply embedded in the highest circles of Roman society, and then lose all of it within weeks, through a shift in political alliance he did not orchestrate and often could not have reasonably predicted, a fall from imperial favor he never saw building, or simply an emperor's unpredictable, sometimes genuinely irrational whim. Exile, confiscation of property, forced suicide ordered without any real trial worth the name. These were not distant, rare hypotheticals confined to history books for elite Romans living through the late Republic and early Empire. They were a real, live, standing occupational risk of political and social prominence itself, and everyone who held real power or wealth knew it, whether or not they ever said so plainly out loud at dinner. A philosophy that taught you, in advance and as a matter of regular, disciplined practice, to hold your wealth, your status, your position, even your own physical life, a little more loosely, to locate your actual sense of self-worth, somewhere those specific forces could never fully reach, no matter how badly they wanted to, was not some abstract, purely academic comfort in this environment. It was closer to functional, practical psychological armor for exactly the specific kind of world wealthy and powerful Romans actually had to live inside. This is the single biggest reason Stoicism, more than most of its Greek philosophical rivals, ended up so deeply and permanently embedded in Roman intellectual and political life for the next several centuries. It was not simply intellectually fashionable, though for a period it certainly was that too. It was, in the most literal and practical sense available, useful to exactly the people who most badly needed something that actually worked when their own circumstances turned against them without warning. By the time this story reaches the 1st century of the Roman Empire, Stoicism was no longer simply an imported Greek curiosity practiced by a handful of unusually devoted intellectuals. It had become deeply woven into Roman political, literary, and personal life at the very highest levels, waiting for the 3 men who would eventually become its most famous practitioners in all of history. A wealthy statesman who would rise dangerously close to the absolute center of imperial power and pay a brutal price for it. A slave who would lose every last shred of physical freedom a person can lose, and somehow end up teaching some of the freest thinking on record. And a boy, being carefully, deliberately groomed from a very young age for a throne he almost certainly never actually wanted, who would end up ruling the most powerful empire on earth while quietly writing some of the most searingly honest words about human weakness and effort ever set down on paper, intended for absolutely no reader but himself. That is part 2. If this gave you a clearer picture of where Stoicism actually started, subscribe. Part 2 covers Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius in full. And if you want a daily practice built on exactly this tradition, Becoming Stoic is a free app built for exactly that.